Welcome to this new edition of Voices in Action. Today, BIDAcademy welcomes Enric Sala, Resident Explorer, National Geographic. We have interpretation in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So please choose the language of preference by clicking on the global icon that you find on your screen.
Pristine seas. Of all the things he's done, I really like this book. I was talking to him before. I had the chance to start reading it. I haven't finished it, but yesterday I was reading it and I started reading some parts of it to my daughter, who's a teenager. And especially when you start talking about that Biosphere 2 experiment, I had totally forgotten about that. And it's interesting to think of how we've changed the way we look into nature after that experiment and how important it was for us to start understanding in the 90s what it means to think we're going to be able to rebuild this world and how complicated it is to think how much it is to rebuild this world. And you have asked to start your book, which has the introduction by Our Majesty, the King now, right? And Edward O. Wilson. And he starts the book with some interesting questions, which I hope you will talk about them, which I will read to you so that we can all think of it together. He says, if it's so difficult to keep even small ecosystems stable enough to sustain the life of a handful of humans, how do 9 million species of plants and animals and 1 trillion species of microbes coexist and allow for our survival? How does this Biosphere 1 manage to keep everything alive and in balance? In what way do we depend on all of those other species for our own survival? Very important questions. And as an Amazon person coming from the Amazon, when I started reading the book and thinking why we need the wild for many things. We need the wild for the cosmology of the wild. We need the wild to survive as species. And we need to understand how the wild is interconnected and how the Amazon and the seas and the water, which gives us life, are interconnected. So the nature of nature is with you.
Muito obrigado, Tatiana. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Should I? I'm going to talk about oceans today, but I would love to discuss with you later, Tatiana, about why do we need the Amazon forest, right? Or any of these species, because we need them for everything. But let's make a big leap here, and let's assume that all of you already know why we need the ocean, right? Without the ocean, there would be no life on Earth. The ocean has absorbed 90% of the extra heat. Perdón, voy a hablar en español porque aquí la mayor parte de la audiencia es español.
Okay, I'm going to switch to Spanish because most
Entonces,
of our
el mar
audience
es
here
tan
is
importante porque por
Spanish
tantas
speakers. Well, the ocean
razones.
is so important for many
Una de ellas
reasons.
es
One of
el
them
mar, el agua del
is
mar
the
ha
ocean.
absorbido el
Ocean water has absorbed
90% de
90%
todo el calor, la
of all the
energía
heat
extra
and the
generada
extra energy
desde la revolución
generated from the
industrial.
Industrial Revolution.
Si ese calor no
If
hubiera
that
sido
heat
absorbido
had
por el
not been
mar,
absorbed by
la
the ocean,
temperatura aquí donde
the
estamos ahora
temperature here where we are now
sería no 2 grados mayor,
would not
que es
be
lo
2
que
degrees
pretende
higher,
no sobrepasar el Acuerdo de
which
París,
is
sino
what
que
the
sería
Paris Agreement intends to
36
not
grados
surpass, but it would be
centígrados mayor.
36 degrees
Sin el mar,
Celsius
solamente con
higher.
ese
So
servicio
without
de capturar esa
the
energía
ocean,
extra,
without that service of
esa es la
capturing that
diferencia entre
extra
la Tierra
energy,
y
that's the
Venus.
difference between
No podría
the
haber
Earth
vida
and Venus.
humana,
There could not be
solamente
human
podría haber
life.
vida
There could only
microbiana
be
en el
microbial
planeta.
life on
Entonces,
that
ese es uno de
planet.
los
So
muchos
that is one of the many
ejemplos
examples
de todos los servicios
of all the
que
services
proporciona el
that
mar.
the oceans
Ahora,
provide us. Now,
a pesar de que el mar permite nuestra vida,
although
estamos
oceans allow for our
destrozando
life,
esa capacidad del
we
mar
are
para
destroying its
proporcionar
capacity
proveer
to provide
para la humanidad.
for
Hay
humanity.
muchos problemas,
And there are many problems.
pero el primero es
The first one is
la sobreexplotación.
overexploitation.
Estas son gráficas que muestran qué pasa, qué
These
ha
are
pasado a lo
charts
largo
that
del
show
tiempo, desde el año
what
60,
happens, what
desde
has
la Segunda
happened
Guerra Mundial,
through time after
especies de
World
peces
War II
invertebrados que se
in
pescan
species of
comercialmente
invertebrates that are
en 2 regiones
caught
alrededor
commercially
de
into
América
regions
Latina
around
y el
Latin
Caribe,
America and the
Pacífico y
Caribbean,
Atlántico.
Pacific, and the
Y
Atlantic.
lo que se puede
And
observar
here
es que
what we can
todas
see is that
esas líneas
all
van
those
para abajo.
lines have a downward
Quiere
trend.
decir,
So what does this mean?
hemos sacado peces del
That we
mar
have
mucho más
extracted
rápido de lo que
fish
se pueden
from the
reproducir.
sea much more rapidly than what they
Tres
than
cuartos
what they could
de todos
reproduce.
los stocks de peces
Therefore,
están
it's all fish
sobreexplotados.
stocks are
A pesar de
overfished,
que esa
overcaught.
industria
In spite of what the industry
y
says,
funcionarios de la FAO
and
y
FAO
científicos y políticos
officials
que
and
están
scientists and
financiados por ello.
politicians that are
Entonces,
financed
este es el gran
by the
problema.
industry. So
Aparte,
this is the
tenemos la
great problem.
contaminación,
Aside from this, we
todos los
have
contaminantes
contamination,
plásticos,
especially
y el
today,
calentamiento
contamination by
global
plastics,
está haciendo que el
and
mar
global
sea más
warming is
caliente y
making
más ácido,
oceans
lo
become
cual está
hotter,
matando arrecifes de coral
warmer,
por
and more
todo el mundo.
acid, which is
Pero
killing
centrémonos
coral reefs
en
around the
esto,
world.
que
But
es
let's
algo
focus on this,
que a pesar de
which
que
is something that, although
históricamente
historically
es la amenaza
it is the
más
threat,
grande a la vida marina,
the largest threat
es
to
la
marine life,
amenaza a la que podemos,
it is
que
the
podemos
threat that
solucionar
we
más
can
rápidamente.
solve more rapidly.
Entonces, sabiendo esto,
So knowing
el
this,
declive de la vida
the
marina y de la
decline
biodiversidad también
in marine life and
supone un
biodiversity also
declive de todos
supposes
esos
a
servicios
decline in
que
all
el
those
mar nos
services
da
that the ocean
de
gives
manera
us
gratis, como
for
seguridad
free,
alimentaria,
as
protección de la
food
costa,
security, the
manglares y
protection of the
arrecifes de coral,
coast,
y muchos
mangroves,
otros.
coral reefs, and many others.
Esto es un ejemplo de lo que ha pasado
This is an example of what has happened in the Caribbean, for example.
desde los años 80, donde había
Since the
arrecifes
80s,
de coral
when
en muy buen estado,
there were
ahora donde
coral
menos
reefs in
del
very
2%
good state,
del
now we're
fondo en el
less
Caribe
than
está
2%
ocupado
of
por corales
ocean
vivos.
bottoms
Esto ha sido
in the
una
Caribbean are
combinación de
occupied by live
contaminación,
corals.
enfermedades,
And this has been because of the
calentamiento global y
contamination
también
of
sobrepesca.
diseases, global warming, and also excessive
Aparte,
fishing.
la manera como
Additionally, the way in which
peces del
we
mar o
extract
invertebrados como
fish
camarón
from the sea or
es tan
invertebrates such as
destructiva que
shrimp is so
algunos
destructive that
lugares,
in some
por
places,
cada kilo
for every kilo
de peces o de camarón
of
que se
fish
extrae,
or shrimp
se matan
that is
10
extracted,
kilos
10
de
kilos of other species are killed.
Pero además, hemos podido
But also,
estimar
we've
que
been able to estimate
el fondo del mar
that
es el
the bottom of
reservorio
the sea is the
sumidero de
reservoir,
carbono más grande de todo el planeta.
is the carbon
El
filter, the
primer
largest
metro
one
del
on the
sedimento
planet.
al fondo del mar
The first,
tiene
when
dos
the
veces
sediment at
más
the bottom of
carbono
the
que todos
ocean
los
has
suelos de la Tierra.
twice as more carbon than all the soils
Uno diría, "Guau,
on Earth. And
qué
one would
bien,
say,
el mar
well,
está
great.
capturando, secuestrando mucho más
Oceans
carbono de
are
lo que
capturing,
pensamos". El
sequestering much more
problema
carbon than
es
what
que
we expected.
con la pesca
But the problem is that
a pescar
with
camarón y peces, al arrastrar
trawl
esas
fishing,
redes tan
by
pesadas y tan grandes,
using these very
estamos
large and very heavy
resuspendiendo ese
nets,
sedimento y el
we
carbono que hay en el
are
sedimento.
moving around that sediment and the
Lógicamente,
carbon that is
no
in the
está
sediment. And
enterrado,
when that
para
carbon is
siempre,
not
sino que
buried
está
forever,
disponible
but
para
it
los
is
microbios del
available
agua,
for the
parte de ese
microbes in the
carbono
water,
pasa
part of
a dióxido
that
de
carbon
carbono,
becomes
o
carbon
CO2.
dioxide,
Hemos
CO2.
estimado
And we've
que las
estimated
emisiones
that
de
the
CO2 en el
CO2
agua
emissions
debido a
in
la pesca
water
cada
due to
año son de la misma
fishing
magnitud
each
que
year
las
are
emisiones
the
de
same
CO2
magnitude than those of
a nivel global.
aviation
Entonces, no solamente estamos destrozando los
globally. So
hábitats
we're not
de
only
las especies
destroying
que nos queremos comer,
the
estamos
habitats of the fish that
causando
we
un
want to see,
declive sobre
but we're
pesca de todas esas especies,
causing a
lógicamente
decline
estamos contribuyendo
and
al
we're
calentamiento global debido
contributing
a la manera como pescamos. Entonces, ¿cuál es la solución?
to their destruction
Y voy a hablar
by all this
hoy de
trawling.
una solución
Now,
que
what am I going to talk about today? A solution that we know
que son
works.
las áreas
which are the MPAs, marine protected areas, where there is no fishing. I'd like to show you an example so that you can see what happens when in a place we stop killing marine life. This is an example that I love. This is in Cabo Pulmo in Baja, California, where in the 90s, the local fishermen were so desperate because there were not enough species to eat because of this excessive or this overfishing that they decided to ask the Mexican government to create an area, a no-take area of 70 square kilometers. The Mexican government listened to them and created Cabo Pulmo National Park. 70 square kilometers, it's relatively small, where there is no fishing activity. When we arrived a few years after the protection, there was nothing. You have sponges growing on the rocks, and there you could see 4 little fishes. And then we returned 10 years later, and everything had changed. It's the same place. We saw that degraded, overexploited area recover to a pristine state, including the recovery of large predators such as groupers, jacks, sharks, an extraordinary abundance. Around the world, we've seen that. Well, what happens when you do not kill fish? Well, they take longer to die and they grow more. And what we've seen around the world is that in these zones where there is no fishing, the fish biomass, the abundance of fish is increased by 600% in less than 10 years. If someone knows a company or stock market that produces this, please let me know after this presentation. Now, these are the zones that are completely protected from fishing, the green ones. The areas that are protected, but where fishing is allowed, do not even double the abundance of fish, and in many cases, they cannot be distinguished from the non-protected areas. Surely many of you will say, oh yes, we have to keep a balance between protection and exploitation, and the only way to recover marine life is by not killing it. It sounds dumb, but for those of you that know about conservation, I'm sure that you know that this is a fact. We can protect and we can allow commercial fishing in a sustainable manner. It's physically and biologically impossible. In the zones where we actually do protect, marine life recovers. But not only marine life recovers, but in the limits, but also it is generating an economic recovery in those areas. In Cabo Pulmo, the visionary fishermen of the 90s no longer fish. They're taking tourists, divers, to look at this variety of fish that doesn't exist anywhere else, and they have per capita income that is higher than the average, than the mean in Mexico. They're making a lot more money now taking people to dive than before when they were breaking their backs fishing. So this is an example in the Galapagos Islands where we carried out a study a few years ago where we saw that marine tourism brings $154 million to the Galapagos each year, while fishing only brings around $4 million. Tourism employs over 5,000 individuals, while today it's less than 500 people that work in fishing. So economically and socially, those marine reserves create a number of jobs and economic revenues that are much higher than the continuous overexploitation. Additionally, those reserves are helping to regenerate the surrounding areas. This is an example. This is Daniel, a friend of ours, and Juan Fernandez in Chile. Chile, 10 years ago, in those islands that are 200 miles off the coast of Chile, they asked us for help because they were tired of not catching fish. They've been catching lobsters sustainably, but they complained that the industrial fleets that were fishing around the islands were depleting the entire fish stocks. So we talked to the community. The community asked the government of President Bachelet to protect an enormous area around the islands. And in her last year in administration, she created this enormous area, absolutely closed around the areas where fishing was only allowed in the coastal area by traditional fishermen, but the rest of the area was totally protected. And Daniel, in his Facebook, he posted this picture. These were the fish that had disappeared before the reserve was created. And how is it that this happens? Fish not only, well, this is a very simple thing. It's so evident. It's incredible that there are still deniers, people that deny that there's excessive fishing and that deny that protecting marine life actually yields benefits. And we know that large females are the ones that produce most of the eggs. They're the ones that are responsible for the regeneration of the population, because a female can grow this big in length, but it grows in 3 dimensions also in volume. And we've seen that a female like this can produce 25 million eggs a year. And if we let her grow a little bit more, she can produce 25 million eggs. So the contribution of large fish to the recovery of these stocks is extremely high. And the only place where we observe fish in their maximum size is in the zones where there is no fishing. You can manage fisheries as you wish or as you think best fit. But as long as you continue to extract fish from the ocean, you'll never have fish reach this size that will allow to restock these populations. So this spillover effect that helps regenerate the zones, the surrounding zones. A very good example in the Galapagos Islands. Here to the left, we have this capture by units of effort. Those blue zones are where there's very little fishing. Red zones where more tuna was caught by the industrial tuna fleet, Ecuadorian tuna fleet. The marine reserve was expanded, and now fishing is located to the west of the reserve because we have this spillover. And in that area, the Ecuadorian fleet is fishing more tuna with less effort, which also means that the economic benefits are enormous. Another example that we have here is a study that was just published. The United States has the largest reserve in the world on the islands to the northeast of Hawaii, Papahanaumokuea Marine National Monument, created by President Bush. It's enormous. Compared to the 70 square kilometers of Cabo Pulmo, is very big. It's the largest one in the world. A few years later, after the expansion of the monument, they are fishing 54% more yellowfin tuna due to the spillover of the reserve. And also when we protect those zones and we have that abundance, that enormous abundance of fish, that is making the ecosystem be more resilient to global warming. And this can sound a bit abstract, but I'm going to show you an example. This is in the Southern Line Islands in the Republic of Kiribati in the South Pacific. This is Vostok Island, one of the 5 uninhabited islands. They are completely protected, 12 miles around them. We were there in 2009. It was the first expedition that we did with National Geographic and pristine seas. And what we saw in 2009 was an absolutely virgin coral reef, the bottom covered by live coral with sharks and an extraordinary number of fish. The government of Kiribati protected the area, and we said, okay, this place has been saved forever. But in 2015, 2016, there was the strongest El Nino event, the strongest one in history. The water warmed, it heated excessively for a period of time, which was 3 times longer than any other El Nino that had occurred in history. And what happened? Even in the most pristine and protected reef in the world, half the corals died, half, in a single summer. My colleagues were desperate. They said, okay, there's no hope for the coral reefs of the world. And even the most pristine and protected reef has succumbed, and half of the corals have disappeared in a matter of 3 months. But I thought, we're saying that biodiversity helps resilience. And if there's a place where we can prove this experimentally, it's here. Let's give the reef a few years. Then COVID came and we had to give it a few years. We were obliged to. And then 5 years later, after the warming, we were able to return. The reef had completely recovered, completely. And this is the example of resilience and recovery of coral reefs. This is the most extraordinary case that we've ever measured. Why? Because this area is protected. All of this was dead 5 years ago. This is growth of 5 years ago. We measured how many new coral colonies exist, how many new coral colonies, because we had the results from before the warming, right before, and then 5 years later. And we measured that in each square kilometer, there were from 5 to 8 million new colonies of coral. That's the natural recovery rate of a reef. Between 8 to 10 million colonies per square kilometer. That is not something that we can recolonize with coral fragments or anything. And this is achieved because of the extraordinary abundance of fish, including these surgeon fish that are constantly eating at the bottom and feeding and providing and allowing the algae to recover the reefs. This does not happen where you have natural herbivores. This does not exist almost anywhere in the Caribbean, for example. So now, I suppose that now we're all convinced that marine reserves do work and that they have benefits both for the marine life as well as for humanity and the climate. And if they work so well, how many do we have? In total, there are around 7,000 marine protected areas around the world. But most of them are so small that they only protect 8% of the global oceans. 8% in zones that are protected. But most of the MPAs in Northern Europe allow trawl fishing under the argument that it is a sustainable activity that is compatible with conservation. Today, only 3% of the oceans at a global level are actually protected from fishing, mining, oil extraction, and other harmful activities. How much do we have to protect? What is the minimum that we need to protect? Some colleagues carried out a study and they reviewed 144 scientific studies that estimated the percentage of the ocean that should be protected to obtain different benefits, from protection of biodiversity to avoiding the collapsing of species, increasing the value of fisheries, etc. And what they discovered is that as a mean, 37% of the ocean should be protected to obtain that series of benefits. Last year, we also published a study after 4 years of work where we identified what the most important zones to be protected globally are. We published this in Nature magazine to have biodiversity benefits so that spillover from the reserves could actually cause a net increase so that there could be more fish to fish or to capture and to help mitigate climate change. And what we also saw is that if we protect at least 30% in these colored zones, we would protect biodiversity. There would be more fish to eat, and we would be helping the ocean to sequester much more carbon. We would be avoiding emissions equal to the emissions of aviation globally. So therefore, this is the number, 30 by 30. This is the reason when you hear 30 by 30, why we are asking for this with the support of 113 countries. And we hope that this will be the global target that we will be adopted in COP15 in the Biodiversity Convention that will be held in December in Montreal. So from here, we have this 30 by 30. But then, of course, you're going to say, well, but we can't have that luxury. We don't have the money, nor do we have the money to help the global south and help mitigate and adapt to global warming. And we have even less money for the conservation of the sea. It's not economically possible. How much would it cost to protect 30% of the ocean? We already know that if we protect 30% and adequately, there would not be a cost on fishing. There would be, on the contrary, more fish, as we have demonstrated in the Galapagos and in Hawaii, in Cabo Pulmo. We know that for every dollar that is invested in the creation and management of a marine reserve, that dollar generates $10 in economic output. A return of 1,000%. So there are no opportunity costs here. What is the management cost of a network of marine reserves that covers 30% of the sea? The best estimate that we have is of $20 billion a year. $20 billion a year. That sounds like a lot. $20 billion is the money that the governments of the world give each year to the fishing industry to continue with this overfishing, including by almost giving them diesel for free, then creating new ships for free. These harmful subsidies, these perverse subsidies, that what they do is contribute to this overexploitation. Trawl fishing in many areas, if it wasn't because of the subsidies by governments, it would not be profitable, economically speaking. So this is an assistance that is definitely disproportionate due to the contribution that that industry makes to society. 20 billion. If we redirect and with climate change, of course, with less than half of the subsidies to the oil industry, there would be enough to cover those $2 trillion that are now being mentioned in COP27. But the money is there. The governments have decided to use it to fund and to subsidize these systems that destroy our survival systems. And also another comparison, another odious or hateful comparison, is that today the world spends 3 times more, almost 4 times more on ice cream than what it would cost to protect this 30% a year. So I've made my case, Your Honor.
Why do we need 30 by 30? It is very clear scientifically. Economically also, the case is clear. This would not cost anything to society. The only ones that would lose out are the fishing mafia who are destroying global commons, those who get away with murder. Those are the over-exploiters, those that take most of public subsidies. Those are the only companies or individuals that lose. The developing countries would gain and they would be able to increase their food and their food stability. The global economic output would be much higher if we protected 30% of the sea. And it can be done. It can be done because there are countries who have already done it, such as the Seychelles, Chile, Colombia, Palau, Niue. Those are fishing nations, and they have decided, because they understood that there was no future for fisheries and for local communities unless that 30% is protected in order to help regenerate the other 70%, which where activities have to be taken care of responsibly. This is all I will say for now. I thank you so much for your attention. And now I will be delighted to answer your questions and have a discussion with you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ángel.
Thank you so much.
Yo estaba pensando en la Amazonía.
I was thinking of the Amazons, but I am not going to start with that. I will offer the floor for questions. I know that there are many people here who wish to ask questions. Yes, please go ahead. Francisco Vázquez, a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming. I'm from Alacaupulmo. I am totally convinced about the benefits of protected areas and of the damages caused by trawling fishery. I also have a fish farm. I would like to know what you think about fish farms. In the United States, they are forbidden because of aesthetic reasons, but because they are prohibited, the trawling fishery continues. Thank you so much, Francisco. We both love Cabo Pulmo, the fishery of wild fish in the sea. Everybody talks about peak oil. We have reached peak fish in the 90s. From 1996, global fishing has diminished, although more efforts have been deployed. While the production of fish with fishery farms and half of the fish that are consumed today come from aquaculture. So aquaculture is here to stay and it will continue growing. It is a solution for world food safety, yes. Does it help to diminish pressure on the sea? No. Why? Because we have algae, marine algae farms. There's so many in China. You don't need to add any fertilizers. They grow. They are then taken and they grow again. But in the north, we like to eat predator fish. And I will give you the example of salmon. To produce 3 kilos of, no, 1 kilo of salmon, in order to produce 1 kilo of salmon, you need 3 kilos of fish. So we're trawling the bottom of the sea, we're catching fish, we turn it into fish flour, and then we feed the salmon. So 3 for 1. This is not very efficient. In the case of Chile, we have Chilean friends here. We have those farms in the Chilean fjords, and we have the Atlantic salmon, which has been brought over to the Pacific, but there have never existed salmons in the southern hemisphere. It is ecologically wrong. They are put together in such a dense population for them to reproduce themselves that they're full of parasites and diseases. The parasites contaminate local fish. And to solve the problem of fish, the companies in Chile are throwing a lot of antibiotics to the sea, and those end up being eaten by salmon consumers, and this creates antibiotic resistance to consumers. In addition to that, farm salmon, which is not an ecological situation, the way they are grown, they need to be injected chemical colors to make it look a bit orange, to make it look the color of salmon. And with all those wastes, the fjords, which used to be pristine in Chile, and I can tell you because I was there, we had several expeditions there, I have seen it. Those fjords end up being completely depleted of oxygen. So the farms need to be pulled towards the south where the water is clearer. So it is a sequence of destruction, and hundreds of thousands of salmons escape. They colonize the local rivers, and in some rivers in Chile, salmon is already being reproduced, although there was never salmon in the past. So this is quite a dramatic example. There are other areas where this is better, but this explains why aquaculture should not take place, because it is contributing even more to the destruction of the sea, and it has bad consequences for human health. We have a question online from Leticia Ortega. It says, which are the current barriers to control the presence of brown algae in the Caribbean, and how could aquaculture help diminish commercial fishing? The second question, I believe I have already spoken about. If aquaculture is done well, so if the fish are not fed with flour from fishes or from the sea, then it's okay. As to the algae, there is no way to control this with human intervention. The proliferation of those brown algae is due to a combination of fertilizers that go to the sea, the warming of the waters, and in the reefs, it is also due because there are not enough herbivores that eat those algae. So at the regional level, because we are speaking about a regional impact, the only thing that can be done, same thing as with climate change, reduce carbon emissions, reduce organic contamination, which in turn means that upstreams there should be more forests, such as the Amazons, and also there should be many more protected zones where fish can recover, and this can be controlled naturally. So this is an example of how the fact that everything is interconnected, the Amazon is connected to the sea via the rain, and the deforestation of the Amazon can also bring a lot of sediment to the sea, which has deleterious effects on marine life. The solutions are also very diverse, and everything must be done in a coordinated manner. Rafael Anta, I work at the IDB. Your presentation shows that scientific evidence exists to make your case, and you frequently meet with countries and governments to make the case. And despite this, I imagine that many countries do not take the necessary steps to protect whatever they need to protect within their territories. I know that there are many challenges. Do you think one of the challenges is how to make it, how to manage this protection, and what are the politicians lacking, and why don't they dare do it? Thank you. The greatest obstacle is political will. President Bachelet, when we would talk about the protection of these areas, would say, well, I know that the Minister of Fisheries is going to oppose this. So I need economic arguments to prove that this is going to benefit fisheries. So the fishing industry, which had collapsed and continued overfishing species that we were trying to protect in the marine protection areas. So we have a situation whereby the fisheries lobby, just like the oil lobby, produces cherry picking and misinformation in order to make their case avoiding the scientific evidence and always with arguments which are not based on facts, because they say that they cannot share data on fishing because that's confidential. But we conservationists are always have to prove up to the very last detail with a lot of studies which have been replicated again and again. So that's a major obstacle. It is the pressure and the opposition of the fishing lobby, which in many countries, despite this has a very low impact at the economic level, although the perception is that they have a high impact. In many countries, the fishing industry has a very small contribution to the GDP. So it is for this reason that we need political will, where there are leaders such as Michelle Bachelet and others, where you tell them this is the scientific evidence, the economic evidence, and the fishing evidence, and this aggregated at the country of the level, it would be good to protect it more because everybody will be benefiting from this instead of going piece to piece. So instead of trying to calm a sector which makes a lot more noise than the others. Yes. Hello, Enric. I am Quijano. I wanted to ask a question which is somewhat related to the previous one. If the protection is to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030, I understand that this should be an initiative which is taken at the global level, involving many countries. How possible would it be to attain this objective in view of the fact that we are in 2023 almost, and we only have 7 years? Thank you for encouraging me. Yes, you're right. We have 8 years basically to multiply by 4 all the marine protection which has been attained throughout history. That's an enormous challenge. There are 2 possibilities. This December in COP15, the biodiversity COP, where all the countries in the world are there, they should commit to this global goal of 30%. And the second level is how to implement it. And this is not going to be implemented globally. Each country will decide which percentage of its waters it wishes to protect, because each country in its exclusive economic area has competence to decide what they're going to protect. Namibia couldn't care less about what Jamaica is doing. So the implementation will need to be done at the country level, and in the case of Europe, at the European level. So that is where economic considerations will come into play, because the scientific evidence is there. More protection results in more fish, but the mentality is to look at the short term, because electoral cycles are much shorter. So the first law in politics is to get reelected. So if I'm going to have an election in 2 years, I am not going to have a fight with the fishing sector who are going to create a lot of problems. We have seen this. We have experience with politicians. So this is where it is very important, especially in the global south, there should be financial help to the countries who have overfished more globally, the global north, in order to help with this transition, in order to help resolve this short-term economic loss, which in many cases it's a perception of loss, such as the case in Hawaii. There was really no loss for the tuna quota in Hawaii. They almost immediately started fishing more. But this assurance of economic help for this short-term transition, which is going to be key in order to have governments take the first step. Very interesting. I am Dan La Rota. I work here at the IDB. I remember when I was in the university, we would study economy of natural resources, and we talked about fishing models, and we were looking for a level of fish to guarantee the repopulation of fish. But my question is refers more to the economic factor. The fact that these zones where there is no fish, does this have an impact on the price of food? Fish and salmon prices have gone up or have they gone down? Do we have studies regarding the repercussions of this on the prices? It has had no repercussions for two reasons. First, because only 3% of the sea is protected, so that is insignificant. And secondly, because in those countries, for instance, in uh, around the monument in Hawaii, they started fishing more immediately. So there was more fish supply immediately. So that is an argument which the Mexican tune industry would present when the government of Peña Nieto was thinking about protecting the national park of the Regijero Islands. And the fishing lobby said, no, the price of tuna is going to go up. We'll have to go further to fish, and this is going to create a rebellion in Mexico, etc. But nothing happened because they did not spend more to fish around the park. And in fact, the boats that were fishing within the reserve before it was created as a reserve, now they're fishing more. So the contrary occurred. Thank you so much, Enric. These were 30 minutes which were very interesting. And these minutes give us hope. As you know, we are a bank, and the bank is a bank who lives on loans, and we are full of economists and financial experts. I am from the side of biodiversity on the old safeguards section, but with the data that you have presented, the return rates for investments in the protection of marine areas is impressive. And so what would be required to at least design a pilot project whereby we can prove the yield, when we can demonstrate that this is a productive investment which improves lives and everything that we like in development banks. So it is not just a question of conservation of biodiversity or saving the planet. It is an investment that will make the lives of people better. It will improve income. It will improve productivity. And the lending countries in the bank, there are only two which are Mediterranean. The others are countries that have a coast. So what do we need to present a project via a Ministry of Finances to test these dates of economic return? Finances, that is the problem. The finance ministers have no clue about this because we have always talked about the environment ministers, tourism ministers, fishing ministries. So that is one of the gaps that we have. We need to outreach to the ministers of finance to make them understand that the extension of the marine protection areas are not an afterthought, they're not an economic cost. They should be considered as another mechanism of economic development. What can be done so that the bank may finance or loan for a pilot project? You don't need a pilot project because we have several cases. The Unukunu Reserve in Fiji, the one in Cabo Polo, and they have dozens of projects. We know that they work. That figure that $1 produces $10 is the average of more than 100 studies around the world. So the only thing that is required, I would like to know from the bank how you can give incentives to a government to make them request a loan in order to develop this mechanism of marine economic regeneration, which should not be considered as part of the economic planning of a nation. So that is a question that I ask you guys. Thank you, Enrique. Roberto Lamartine, you mentioned the role of government and state agencies to reach a 30 by 30. What can we as individuals do to help the attainment of this goal within 30 years? If you live close to the coast, governments, everybody can help. Governments have an important role for the protection of those enormous areas, such as the monument in Hawaii, where nobody lives. That is very important for industrial fishery. But local communities and local tourism businesses have an important role, which they have not taken up, perhaps because they do not know that if they create smaller protected areas locally, that would have local benefits. Rafa and I spend a lot of time in the Mediterranean, and there are areas such as the Medas Islands in Catalonia. It is only 1 square kilometer, only 1 square kilometer which is protected. That square kilometers generates 12 million euros per year for snorkeling and diving tourism. So it is an excellent business because it does not have a reason. Why shouldn't each coast municipality a marine reserve? It's an excellent business like hotels and restaurants. So what citizens should do would be to play an enormous role activating the community, local businesses to create marine reserves at the local level, and examples of local marine reserves which have been done under the leadership of communities are about 1,000. There have been 1,000 which have been created and managed by local communities. So I believe that that is the most important role that citizens can have, in addition, of course, to you who have access to the governments of the countries in the region, to be in touch with the Minister of Finance and make the ministers of finance, environment, and tourism, who probably don't talk to each other so much because usually the Minister of Finance will think this is something that is going to cost me. And this is where you can help in order to try to reach out to the countries where you work.
Tengo otra pregunta online de
Another
Karina
question
Pasut.
online from Karina
Dice,
Pasut.
no
She says,
deberíamos, además de trabajar
in
en
addition to
protección de los
working
océanos,
in the protection of
trabajar
oceans,
también en la
shouldn't be also
protección de
working
ciertas
for the
especies,
protection
como
of
por
certain
ejemplo
species,
los
such
tiburones
as
que son ampliamente
sharks,
depredados por
which
el humano
are
solo por
uh,
sus aletas, teniendo un
killed
impacto
by humans
negativo en el
due there,
ecosistema marino?
and this has a negative impact on the marine ecosystem. Yes, I totally agree. There are species that move so much, such as tuna, or the groupers move very little. So you protect a very small area, and groupers are going to reproduce because they do not move. But tuna or shark, a white shark marked by satellite, we have seen that the shark goes almost on a direct line from South Africa to Australia. There are gray sharks, which also swim for thousands of kilometers. So some fish move a lot more than the size of the majority of reserves. This is why the areas that are limited have, we also need to limit fishing these species that move beyond the protected areas.
Bueno, mi nombre es Carolina
I am
Gutiérrez
Carolina
y
Gutierrez.
yo quería saber si vos
I wanted to
considerás
know
que hay
whether
alguna
you
acción
consider
educativa,
that there is
formativa,
an
que sea
education or
potencialmente
training measure which
certera
could
para poder
be
generar
especially
conciencia, no
adequate
solo entre los
to
adultos, sino desde
create
los primeros años.
to
Pienso porque
create conscience
yo
amongst
vengo de una
adults from
región
the
donde el
very
mar
beginning,
nos
because I come
queda
from a region
miles de
where
kilómetros y
the
para mí la idea de
sea is
pescado es una
hundreds
lata.
or
Entonces,
thousands of
no,
miles away. So
no
for
me
me, fish
imagino,
is in a can.
no
So it is
dimensiono
very
todo esto
difficult
que
for
vos me
me
acabas
to
de contar.
imagine
Y al
what
mismo
you have just
tiempo
said.
veo
And
miles
I
de,
also,
no
at
sé,
the same
de
time,
cosas
I
a nivel
see
educativo, a nivel
thousands of
primario,
things
secundario, en
which
los
are
primeros años,
part of
que
the
hablan de los océanos
elementary
de
and
alguna
secondary
manera
education where they
poética o
talk
lo que fuera,
about
pero
oceans in a poetic
seguimos
way, but we
sin generar
continue without
conciencia o dimensión de esto que vos
making
tan
people
crudamente nos has
understand
contado hoy.
what you have
Primero,
told
si
us
es que hay
today.
alguna
I'm
acción que
wondering
vos
whether
consideres
there are
potencialmente
measures
certera y
which you
segundo,
think are
si
especially
conoces
useful,
que haya,
and
como
secondly,
para que uno
whether
tenga
you
una
know
idea y
some
trate de hacer algo
so that
parecido.
we can
No,
perhaps try to
pregunta
do
fácil.
something similar. Easy question.
Hay tantas cosas.
There are so
A ver,
many
no todo el
things, and
mundo
not
tiene que
everybody
trabajar para la
has
protección del
to
mar.
work
También
for
tiene que
the
haber
protection
gente
of the
que viva
sea.
cerca del
There are
páramo o de
also
la selva
people
amazónica
who
que se
have to
preocupe
live
solamente de la selva
close to
amazónica.
the
Nosotros,
Amazons
con
and need
70%
to be
del
worried
planeta
about the
tenemos
Amazons.
suficiente, no podemos
We
también
have
trabajar
70%
con
of the
los
planet,
ricos
so
que
we
trabajan en
cannot,
la selva
that's enough for
tropical,
us.
¿no?
We cannot also
Entonces,
work with our friends who work on
no te
tropical
sientas mal,
forests. So
Marte quede lejos,
don't feel bad about the
pero
fact that the sea is far away from you.
hay muchos recursos hoy en
There
día,
are many
cantidad
resources nowadays.
de documentales
There are a lot of
y de vídeos
documentaries
educativos que
and
hay en
educational
internet
videos on the
disponibles
internet
gratis
which are available. They're
enormes.
free. There's an enormous amount of
David
them.
Attenborough,
David Attenborough,
una de las últimas
one
series
of the
que
last
narró fue
series
Our Planet.
narrated was called Our
Está
Planet.
disponible
It
en
is
Netflix.
available in Netflix.
En esa
In
serie,
that
por primera
series,
vez,
for the
él
first time,
habla
he
de los
talks
problemas
about
que
problems
afectan, no solamente
which
mostrando la cosa
he doesn't
poética
only show the
y bonita
poetic
con
and
animales
beautiful
salvajes
thing with
y
wild
ecosistemas sin gente,
animals
¿no? Sino
in
por primera vez metiendo a las
ecosystems, but
personas
for the first
en la
time,
ecuación y también
bringing
hablando
people
de
into
sus
the equation and
soluciones.
also talking about
Y con
solutions.
esa serie
And with this
crea una serie
series,
de recursos
there is a
educativos,
series of
vídeos
educational
cortos
tools. There are
explicando
short videos
todos esos,
which
¿no? ¿Qué es lo que nos da
explain
la naturaleza?
what
¿Qué
nature
estamos
gives
haciendo
to us,
nosotros a la
what is
naturaleza? Y
occurring with
ejemplos de
nature,
soluciones, ¿no?
and
Eso están
examples of
disponibles
solutions. And those
en
videos
línea,
are
gratis, ¿no?
available online for free.
Ahí sí que es cuestión
So
de los padres o
parents,
maestros en escuelas,
teachers in
sistemas
schools
escolares que utilicen esos
should
recursos. National
use
Geographic también
those resources. In
tenemos
National Geographic,
una cantidad
we
de
have
material
a
educativo
large
también
amount of
gratis disponible
educational material
para, para
which is
maestros.
free and
Durante
is
la pandemia, el
available for
primer año,
teachers. During
no
the
recuerdo
first year of
cuántos
the pandemics,
millones
I do not recall
de
how
euros
many
alrededor del mundo
million of
utilizaron esos recursos para
educators
tener a los
around the
niños
world use
en
those
casa, ¿no?
resources when the
Y
kids were at
especialmente
home
utilizar el Zoom.
and they had to
Entonces, los
use
recursos
Zoom.
están ahí disponibles,
So
hay muy buenos
resources are
recursos.
there, they're
Ahí sí que es
available,
cuestión de
they're
que
excellent
cada
resources,
am,
and
grupo escolar
each
los
school group
utilice o que
should use them
los haga parte de su
or
currículum.
should make
Bueno,
them part
hay
of their
muchas otras
curriculum.
preguntas
There are
muy
many other
interesantes,
questions.
muy
This is
didácticas.
very
Muchas
interesting,
gracias.
very
La
didactic.
exposición fue
Thank you
muy buena,
so much for your presentation,
muy
which was
comprensible y un
excellent,
poco
very
raro.
easy to understand
Nosotros
and
ahora,
very
como
clear.
banco, un reto,
Now, as the bank,
desafío,
we have a
conservación
challenge.
de
How
recursos
will
dulces.
we
Sí.
protect the
Y
waters
tenemos
of the
toda la
sea?
oportunidad
And we
de
have the
conversar más.
opportunity
Pienso que
to
para nosotros
continue our talk.
tener el
I believe that
conocimiento
for us
científico
to
de
have
forma clara, porque hay
clear
muchos
scientific
artículos,
knowledge,
hay
because sometimes there
informes,
are
pero no están
articles or
tan
videos, but they are
contemplados, las
not as
económicas, los
clear. They do not
socioambientales.
speak
Y
about
como no
economic
hay
consequences.
biosferos,
And since there is not a
como la
second
biodiversidad
biosphere,
claramente
and
es
how
importante para el
biodiversity is
conocimiento,
very important
espero que en
with regard to
COP27
climate
19 se
questions. I
resalte
hope that
más
in the
ambiente, proteger la
COP19 it will be
floresta,
clear,
ser
because we should
inteligente,
not only protect
proteger el mar
the
y la
forest and
diversidad,
the
proteger la
biodiversity and protect
biodiversidad para
the
nosotros
seas.
mantener
We need to
resiliencia
protect
a lo que viene.
biodiversity so that we can
Muchas
be
gracias por
resilient.
estar aquí con
Thank you
nosotros.
so
Gracias a
much
todos los
for
que
being here with
participaron
us. Thank you
acá
very
y en
much for
línea.
all of those who have participated here in presence and online.